Hey there, true crime enthusiasts. If you love deep dives into the most gripping cases, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below with your theories or insights as we unravel today's mystery. Let's dive in. The Carr family led an idyllic life before the summer of 1988 in the quiet town of Alturas, Florida. Known for their unwavering faith, the family attended church every Sunday and epitomized a peaceful, trouble-free existence. Peggy Carr, the mother, worked tirelessly as a waitress at the local diner after raising 3 children on her own. Her life took a positive turn when she met and married Peggy Carr, who brought 2 more children into their blended family. Together, they created a loving household, embodying the essence of a happy, unified family in a community where people felt so safe that no one locked their doors. However, this serene life was shattered on June 14, 1988. That day, 16-year-old Dwayne Carr, Peggy's son, discovered an anonymous letter in their mailbox. The note was stark and terrifying, warning that the family must leave Florida within 2 weeks or face deadly consequences. Understandably shaken, Dwayne rushed to show the letter to his parents. Peggy was immediately gripped by fear, her mind racing with worry over who could have sent such a threatening message and why. Peggy Carr, on the other hand, dismissed the letter as a cruel prank or a hoax, choosing not to believe that their family could truly be in danger. Despite Peggy's attempts to maintain normalcy, the unsettling nature of the letter lingered in their minds as summer turned to fall, planting seeds of growing anxiety within the Carr household. On October 23, 1988, the Carr family's lives took a tragic and mysterious turn. In the early hours of the morning, Peggy Carr left for work at the local diner, as she did every day. However, shortly after arriving, she began experiencing alarming symptoms: a burning sensation in her legs and feet, followed by intense chest pain. Her condition deteriorated so rapidly that she was rushed to the hospital, almost incapacitated. Despite thorough testing, doctors were unable to identify the cause of her illness and sent her home with pain medication, assuming it was a passing ailment. Over the next week, Peggy's symptoms grew worse. Her nausea intensified, and she was plagued by excruciating pain. Even more alarmingly, her once vibrant hair began to fall out in clumps, a shocking and distressing development. On October 30th, the nightmare escalated. Not only was Peggy rushed back to the hospital, but her son Dwayne and her stepson Travis began exhibiting identical symptoms. The unbearable pain left all 3 in tears, convinced they were going to die. Peggy was admitted to the intensive care unit, where an infectious disease specialist took note of her alarming hair loss. This clue led the specialist to suspect poisoning, prompting him to order tests for thallium, a highly toxic substance that had been banned in the US in 1972, but was still found in old rat poison. The results were horrifying. Peggy had 50 times the lethal amount of thallium in her system. The next day, on October 31st, Peggy's condition worsened drastically, and she slipped into a coma. Travis was placed on a respirator, while Dwayne's symptoms showed no signs of improvement. As the family's suffering continued, the situation reached a critical point, and the police launched an urgent investigation. Their primary goal was to find the source of the poisoning and prevent further harm to the Carr family. Authorities tested everything they could think of: the neighborhood's water supply, the nearby orange groves, and even the diner where Peggy worked. But they found no traces of thallium. Meanwhile, the community of Alturas was gripped by fear. News of the poisoning spread quickly, and residents began to panic, demanding answers and fearing for their own safety. As the police investigation into the Carr family's poisoning intensified, authorities left no stone unturned in their search for answers. Investigators descended upon the Carr home, meticulously combing through every corner for potential evidence. Dust samples were collected, and over 400 household items were taken for laboratory analysis. Among the items collected was a 6-pack of Coke bottles, 3 of which remained unopened. When tested, the results raised alarm bells. Each of the unopened bottles contained more than 1 gram of thallium, enough to kill an adult. This discovery confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The poisoning was not accidental. The contaminated Coke bottles suggested that someone had deliberately tampered with the drinks. The lead detective on the case quickly realized there were 2 potential scenarios: The first was product tampering at the bottling factory. If this were the case, the implications were horrifying. Poisoned Coke bottles could have reached stores nationwide, endangering countless lives. The potential scope of such contamination extended far beyond the Carr family, causing widespread panic throughout Alturas. Authorities swiftly collaborated with Coca-Cola to investigate this possibility. However, after a thorough review, it was deemed physically impossible for the tampering to have occurred at the factory. The bottling process was tightly controlled, and no breaches in security were found. This revelation eliminated the possibility of large-scale product tampering and led the investigation in a new direction. The second scenario, far more chilling, was that the poisoning was a targeted attack specifically aimed at the Carr family. With this conclusion in mind, the police shifted their focus inward, examining those closest to Peggy Carr and her household. They began to scrutinize her husband, Perrin Carr, as a potential suspect. Perrin's behavior raised eyebrows early in the investigation. Despite being married to Peggy for only 7 months, their relationship had already shown signs of strain. Perrin worked long hours at a local mine, and Peggy had grown suspicious of his fidelity. On one occasion, she caught him in a compromising situation with another woman, further fueling doubts about his loyalty. Adding to the suspicion, the timing of Peggy's initial illness coincided with Perrin being conveniently out of town. Upon his return, he showed a reluctance to take Peggy to the hospital, dismissing her symptoms as a passing illness. These details painted Perrin as a potential culprit in the poisoning, and investigators began digging into his background and possible motives. However, one key detail complicated the theory. If Perrin had orchestrated the poisoning, why would he risk harming his own son, Travis, who also became gravely ill? This question puzzled investigators and left them searching for further evidence to determine the true perpetrator. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement's scrutiny turned more sharply toward Perrin Carr, Peggy's husband. His behavior and the circumstances surrounding the case seemed to raise numerous red flags. Detectives were particularly intrigued by the couple's strained relationship. Peggy's children, Dwayne and Sissy, revealed that tension had been growing between Peggy and Perrin in the months leading up to her illness. These revelations heightened the suspicion that Perrin might have played a role in the tragedy. The Carr family dynamic painted a picture of discord. Peggy, a loving mother of 6, had struggled to balance her new marriage with her responsibilities to her children. She and Perrin had married only 7 months before the poisoning incident, and their union was far from harmonious. Peggy confided in her children and close friends about her growing concerns regarding Perrin's faithfulness. She had even caught him in compromising situations that fueled her fears of infidelity. This breach of trust deepened the emotional divide between them. Adding to the tension, Perrin appeared to show little urgency when Peggy's symptoms first manifested. Despite her debilitating pain and visible deterioration, he hesitated to take her to the hospital, attributing her condition to stress or a mild illness. This apparent indifference raised questions about his motives, with some suggesting he might have sought to downplay the severity of her condition for nefarious reasons. Detectives began to probe deeper into Perrin's life. They examined his financial records, hoping to uncover a motive, such as a life insurance policy or financial gain, that might explain his potential involvement. However, no significant evidence emerged from this angle. The investigation also failed to produce any direct proof linking him to the poisoned Coke bottles or thallium. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Perrin's actions continued to draw scrutiny. Investigators noted that he rarely visited Peggy in the hospital during her final days, a detail that struck her family and friends as cold and suspicious. This behavior further alienated Perrin from the Carr family and cast a long shadow over his character. While suspicion remained heavy on Perrin, the police were careful not to jump to conclusions without sufficient evidence. The case was still riddled with unanswered questions. Why would Perrin risk poisoning his own son, Travis, who had also fallen critically ill? This paradox continued to perplex investigators, leaving them unsure whether Perrin was the true culprit or merely an unfortunate figure entangled in a much larger mystery. As the investigation progressed, the spotlight shifted from Perrin Carr to someone far less expected: George Treppel, a seemingly unremarkable neighbor. George, who lived with his wife Diana in the house adjacent to the Carr family, had long maintained a cordial but distant relationship with them. However, a deeper look into his life began to unravel startling possibilities. George was a self-proclaimed genius, with an IQ well above average, and he had a peculiar passion for puzzles, chemistry, and crime novels. His interests, while eccentric, were not initially considered suspicious. Yet as investigators dug into his background, they discovered subtle clues that suggested George might not be as innocuous as he seemed. The Carrs and Trepples had experienced occasional friction as neighbors. George and Diana often complained about noise from the Carr family, particularly from the children. These grievances never escalated into outright hostility, but Peggy's children recalled George expressing irritation in veiled, passive-aggressive remarks. To the outside world, this tension appeared minor, yet detectives wondered if it masked deeper resentment. The real breakthrough came when detectives reviewed the timeline and circumstances of the poisoning. George Trepple, as someone with knowledge of chemistry, had the means to handle thallium, a toxic substance not easily acquired or used without expertise. This fact alone was not damning, but when combined with his known penchant for solving complex puzzles and his apparent animosity toward the Carrs, it painted a chilling picture. Adding to their suspicion was George's peculiar demeanor during the investigation. While other neighbors expressed concern and cooperated readily with authorities, George seemed indifferent, even aloof. He offered little assistance to investigators and was uncharacteristically evasive when questioned about his movements and activities around the time of the poisoning. His attitude struck detectives as unusual, given the severity of the crime and its proximity to his home. In an effort to dig deeper, law enforcement obtained a search warrant for the Trepple residence. The search yielded an alarming discovery: multiple books and articles on poisons, including detailed information on thallium. Even more incriminating was a typed document found on George's computer outlining a hypothetical scenario involving poisoning. While it was not a direct confession, the document's eerie similarity to the Carr family's tragedy was hard to ignore. The evidence against George Trepple began to mount, and detectives grew increasingly convinced that he was involved. Yet questions lingered. What was his motive? Was this a random act of cruelty, or was it fueled by his irritation with the Carr family? Investigators knew they were dealing with a complex individual, and building a case strong enough to stand up in court would require even more evidence. The investigation into George Trepple marked a pivotal shift in the case, turning it from a family tragedy into a chilling tale of calculated malice. As suspicions solidified, detectives prepared to delve even deeper into George's psyche and his potential role in the poisoning that had devastated the Carr family. To gather irrefutable evidence against George Trepple, law enforcement decided to deploy an undercover operation, a high-stakes move designed to catch him off guard. Detectives enlisted the help of an agent posing as a fellow crime enthusiast to establish rapport with George, hoping to uncover incriminating statements or actions. The operation centered around George's known love of puzzles, chemistry, and crime. The undercover agent, carefully chosen for their ability to engage George's intellectual curiosity, approached him under the guise of shared interests. Presenting themselves as someone intrigued by poisons and crime solving, the agent quickly gained George's trust. Over several weeks, the agent cultivated a relationship with George. They frequently met to discuss hypothetical crime scenarios, exchanged thoughts on complex puzzles, and debated chemical compounds' uses and effects. These conversations were meticulously recorded, with the hope that George might reveal something critical about the Carr case. During these exchanges, George showed a disturbing level of enthusiasm for discussing poisons, particularly thallium. He spoke in detail about its properties, its historical use in crimes, and its effects on the human body. Although he avoided directly implicating himself in the Carr poisoning, his fascination with the topic and his casual attitude toward the consequences of using such a deadly substance raised serious concerns. A turning point came when the agent steered the conversation toward the Carr family. Subtly, they hinted at knowledge of the poisoning and probed George's feelings about the incident. George remained guarded but made a chilling comment about how some people just can't mind their own business. The statement, while vague, seemed to reflect his irritation with the Carrs and hinted at a deeper motive. To bolster the case, the undercover agent encouraged George to discuss more hypothetical scenarios involving poisoning. In one instance, George described an elaborate plan for using thallium in food or drink, a method strikingly similar to how the Carr family was poisoned. These admissions, though framed hypothetically, provided valuable insight into George's mindset and his potential involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued to scrutinize George's past actions and his interactions with the Carr family. They uncovered additional evidence suggesting premeditation, including a detailed inventory of chemicals and poisons found in George's home. Combined with his suspicious behavior and the information gathered during the undercover operation, investigators felt they were building a compelling case. As the operation concluded, detectives prepared to confront George with the accumulated evidence. The undercover agents' efforts had provided crucial insights, reinforcing the belief that George TRUATH was the mastermind behind the Carr family's poisoning. The stage was set for the next phase, bringing him to justice. As the investigation into George TRUATH intensified, law enforcement began uncovering a series of damning pieces of evidence linking him to the Carr family's poisoning. Each discovery brought the case closer to a definitive conclusion, leaving little doubt about his culpability. The most incriminating find came during a search of George's home. Investigators executed a warrant and meticulously combed through his belongings. In his workshop, they discovered a well-organized collection of chemicals and poisons, including thallium nitrate, the very substance responsible for Peggy Carr's death and the illness of her family. The presence of thallium in George's possession was a significant breakthrough, directly tying him to the crime. Among the other items recovered was a stack of detailed notes and documents related to poisons and their effects. George had kept books and articles discussing thallium poisoning in chilling detail, including information on dosage, symptoms, and methods of administration. These materials suggested an obsessive interest in the substance, further reinforcing the theory that the poisoning was premeditated. Investigators also found evidence that George had been closely monitoring the Carr family. A set of handwritten notes described their movements and behaviors, indicating that George had kept an unsettling watch over his neighbors. These notes painted a picture of a man who had gone to great lengths to study his targets, preparing to act against them. Further analysis of the anonymous threatening notes sent to the Carr family revealed a match to George's typewriter. Forensic experts determined that the distinctive spacing and font used in the letter were consistent with a typewriter found in George's home. This was a critical piece of evidence, directly connecting George to the threats and demonstrating his intent to harm the Carrs. Adding to the case was testimony from individuals familiar with George's character and behavior. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as intelligent but reclusive, with a dark sense of humor and a fascination with crime. Some even recalled unsettling conversations in which George had expressed disdain for people who he felt were intrusive or bothersome. These accounts aligned with the profile investigators had developed of someone capable of committing such a calculated and cold-blooded act. Investigators also re-examined George's participation in the Mensa community. They found that he had organized and attended several murder mystery events that involved poisoning scenarios. While this could be dismissed as a hobby, the parallels to the Carr family's case were too striking to ignore, suggesting that George might have drawn inspiration from his own games. As each piece of evidence emerged, the case against George TRUATH grew more compelling. The combination of physical evidence, forensic links, and behavioral patterns painted a damning picture. Investigators were now confident that they had enough to formally charge George and bring him to trial for the murder of Peggy Carr and the poisoning of her family. The walls were closing in, and George TRUATH's meticulously constructed facade was about to crumble. The trial of George TRUATH became a highly publicized event, drawing significant attention due to the bizarre and chilling nature of the case. Prosecutors presented a strong and methodically constructed argument, supported by the substantial evidence collected during the investigation. The case revolved around George's connection to the Carr family's poisoning and his intent to commit murder. The trial opened with the prosecution outlining their theory of the crime. They argued that George had meticulously planned the poisoning, motivated by a combination of malice and his disdain for the Carr family's presence in the neighborhood. Central to their case was the evidence of thallium nitrate found in George's home. The presence of the rare and highly toxic substance, identical to the poison that killed Peggy Carr, was a key component of the prosecution's argument. Expert witnesses took the stand to explain the effects of thallium poisoning and its presence in the victims. Medical professionals detailed the symptoms experienced by the Carr family, while forensic toxicologists testified about the traces of thallium found in Peggy's body and the contaminated Coca-Cola bottles discovered in the Carr home. These experts connected the poisoning directly to the substance found in George's possession. The prosecution also highlighted the incriminating notes and documents found in George's home. They presented the books and articles on poisons, particularly those focusing on thallium, as evidence of George's premeditation. Additionally, the handwritten notes tracking the Carr family's movements and behaviors were introduced, portraying George as a calculating and obsessive individual. A significant turning point in the trial was the forensic analysis of the typewriter. Experts testified that the anonymous, threatening note sent to the Carr family was indeed created using a typewriter recovered from George's home. This direct connection between George and the note demonstrated his intent to intimidate and harm the family. The defense attempted to counter these arguments, portraying George as an eccentric but harmless individual. They suggested that his interest in poisons was purely academic, linked to his fascination with puzzles and murder mysteries. The defense also questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence, attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. However, their arguments failed to resonate with the jury. The trial lasted several weeks, during which the jury heard from dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, forensic experts, and members of the Carr family. The emotional testimony from Peggy's children, who recounted their mother's suffering and the impact of the poisoning on their lives, left a profound impression on the court. In the end, the jury found George Trepel guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Peggy Carr and attempted murder for poisoning the rest of the family. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was met with a sense of relief and justice by the Carr family and the community. At the sentencing phase, the judge described George's actions as cold, calculated, and devoid of empathy. He emphasized the devastating impact of the crime on the Carr family and the broader community. George Trepel was sentenced to death for his crimes, a decision that underscored the severity of his actions. As George was led away to begin his sentence, the Carr family could finally begin to heal, knowing that the man responsible for their pain and loss had been brought to justice. The case left a lasting mark on the community, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. In the aftermath of the trial, the Carr family faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. The trauma of losing Peggy and the suffering caused by the poisoning had left deep scars, both physically and emotionally. The family, once a close-knit and cheerful group, had been forever altered by the events. Despite the pain, they sought to find closure and move forward. For Peggy's children, the loss of their mother was devastating. They remembered her as a loving and caring woman who had always put her family first. The knowledge that she had been taken from them in such a cruel and calculated way added an extra layer of grief. The children had to grapple not only with their mother's absence, but also with the lingering health effects of the poisoning. Although they survived, the physical toll of thallium exposure was significant, and some family members required ongoing medical treatment. The community where the Carr family lived was also deeply affected by the crime. The sense of safety and trust that had once characterized the neighborhood was shattered. Residents struggled to come to terms with the fact that someone like George Trepel, a man they had known as a quiet and seemingly unremarkable neighbor, was capable of such a heinous act. Many people in the area became more cautious, wary of the hidden dangers that might exist in their midst.